me, I feel like is like get some perspective.
No, I love
I
what you're
guess on
saying.
that.
No, it's really interesting to hear this, Tyler. And I think everything you're saying completely resonates with me. And having lived in New York for over a decade, it makes me homesick for New York, quite honestly, because having lived in California for about 6 or 7 years, we really are, we kind of get, we get in our, I mean, I lived in frickin' Malibu for like 6 years. I mean, it's like incredibly white, incredibly privileged. It's such a narrow kind of like 1%er place.
Yeah.
So I like what you're saying, because it's sort of it's a sort of like slap upside the head to just like wake up. But I will say this.
Yeah.
I think clearly you just by watching the news every night, you guys have been hit so much harder. So I think maybe the kind of it's in your face and it's sort of visceral in a way that it's not here in California, at least not now.
Absolutely.
So when I think about a lot of the people, like I had a wonderful conversation with Matt Biolis of Lost Surfboards, and Matt's really smart, articulate guy. And his take was, he said something which is true, is we surfers are really the collateral damage of them having to close the beach because no one was respecting that, especially on the weekends when people that live inland and it gets really hot because we're sort of a desert here, would all come flock to beaches and hence like completely abuse, the completely just flout the whole idea of quarantine.
Totally.
So, I mean, I guess like to be like, I what you're saying
I get
is so
that.
true to me, but, and I think being in a small, one little studio apartment in New York, which I've certainly lived in for long periods of time, that would be like way more cabin fever than I get here in California, where I can walk around the block and, but I think people here, I think like, it's not that the folks, there are some whiners, of course, and I think there are people who are, it's very selfish, but at the same time, they just haven't had they haven't been sort of waterboarded in it the way that a lot of other people have. And when you have friends who are healthcare workers, and when you're living in a city that's been hit hard, it's what you're saying, you become aware of that responsibility much more so.
Yeah, no, it's totally right. And I totally identify with Matt's point of like, if you're having to stay in your local area and then people are coming from out of town and totally not abiding by the social rules that are put in place, like, I mean, that shit drives me nuts now. Like I biked by, a park in the city and people are out, no mask, running, doing stuff. And you're like, I'm trying to do the right thing and you guys are doing this. Well, fuck it then, and then I totally get that. Like, that is so frustrating
for sure. And I think, now it's interesting because had we had this conversation 2 weeks ago, it would be a very different tune. But like right now, people have hit sort of breaking points. And I guess there are some numbers that make people feel like the worst of it might be over, although I won't speak to that. But yeah, it's really, I hear you. And I think I had another great conversation. It was really fun writing that piece because I got to talk to a lot of people I respect tremendously. One of them being Matt Warshaw, author of the Encyclopedia of Surfing. And Matt,
he's so rational.
He's so great. And he pointed out, what was really interesting is that, it's funny because surfing was wiped out once before by a lot of diseases and Calvinist missionaries. But in Hawaii, the combination of those two things, really like surfing in the later 1800s kind of disappeared for a while. And then the other thing that I thought that I really liked that he said, which I used in the piece, was, referring to the great moment in Apocalypse Now where Colonel Kilgore says, you either surf or fight. And he's like, I'm not afraid to surf. I don't care about the bombs going off. And that's like, I think John Milius, along with Francis Ford Coppola, wrote that scene. But the idea, and I think Milius, who was a surfer, had this idea of like, this is the essence of what it means to be a surfer. You just like, fuck you, we do what we want. And Warshaw very, very articulately said, but this is not one of those times, which I thought was really wonderful because it's not sort of, there's nothing kind of to be admired about doing that. It's just plain irresponsible. And that's not something that's not like, a middle-aged person forgetting what it was like to be a teenager. That's basically like whoever you are, whatever age group you're in, this is everyone's involved. It's such a weird thing because there's the one element of we're all in this together, but then there's the stay within your zip code. And that's like another thing we should talk about, which is this like
Yeah.
newfound localism in the surf world, or a kind of return to
Super
localism.
interesting.
It's so bizarre.
I mean, it's yeah, I'm hearing more and more from a lot of people about it. And on one hand, like I can understand a bit of the outrage because of, oh, you're traveling from some other place to here and you could potentially be spreading it. That argument I get. But obviously, surfers particularly can be selfish and self-righteous, as I believe I can be. And but I think, then it morphs into more. It becomes like a disguise for localism.
No,
They can now hide under that umbrella a bit more. I'm curious, like what Lanada Bay is like right now.
no, and you just articulated it perfectly, because I think that really is. It's almost as if that's like some innate thing, and I think it's honestly. I mean, my worldview, my politics, what I like to believe about myself is, the antithesis of the kind of build a wall spirit of Trump. However, I can be there's a like primal animal in me in the water, where a good wave's coming my way, and I'm suddenly like, it becomes almost like a tribal feeling, where it's sort of, no, this is mine, I was waiting, or whatever. And so to see that play out, as you said perfectly, which is it's that sort of stay in your own zip code mentality, but and it's sort of utilizing COVID-19 as like, oh, we can use that as the excuse, but really we'd love to keep enforcing this all the time, probably, which is so strange.
For the next year and a half, 2 years, I mean, it really, you will see a lot more of that, and in certain places, I imagine, like where you can get away with it more.
Absolutely. There was a really interesting piece, and I've been sort of trying to follow it, but Kanoa Igarashi, did you read? He was
Portugal. You got
getting his tires flattened.
Who is he thinking? No.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, though, that I feel is interesting in observing this. I've been doing a series on this whole thing, interviewing different people about the coronavirus from different parts of the surf community. And it's like most of the people are pretty grounded, but it's funny how we remark on the exceptionalism that surfers think that they have.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't apply to me. I surf big waves. I've manned this, and rightfully so. In some ways, you feel like that after surfing a incredible day, or you surf real well. You are feeling quite ego and driven and good and exceptional, and you're like you feel like you have a bit of a superpower in some ways. I feel like being a surfer.
Yeah, no, I know it's interesting, and this is almost a moment to really, it forces this sort of cross-examination of one's ideas and beliefs, because it is really easy to not feel that. It's really easy to sort of tell ourselves that we aren't of that line of thinking, and to certainly like wealth disparity is like a huge issue in the world,
Mm-hmm.
and I can look at that and point it out and think that is so utterly wrong, and yet, if I lived in like somewhere in Humboldt County and there was no one around and there was a fun peak in the empty sea, I would probably be saying to myself, but I get to go out and do this right now because it's not hurting anyone. But in the giant web of which we're all connected, it's sort of like, well, that's not fair to someone who lives in densely populated Huntington, Southern California, who, if they do that, they're basically, it's like the one bad apple thing. So,
yeah,
it really makes you. There's a lot of kind of extended thinking on it all. To that really does make. There is a side to surfers where it is just that we are just so inherently selfish and exceptional.
It's funny, and you would think the human race would learn from all these disaster movies. There's always that one idiot, that one schmuck who has to go back for the one thing, or thinks that they can get away with it, and then they end up letting the disease spread everywhere. That's the thing. That's what I always think about. Maybe that's like the Jewish paranoia in me, but I'm like, what the heck?
Yeah.
Think about the ripple effect of those things.
For sure. But and this is why I'm having homesickness for New York talking to you right now, because I mean, New York, I just think New York, by virtue of riding the subway, by virtue of so many people of so many different stripes kind of being sandwiched together in the city, there is a level of that you come to realize the sort of the cog in the wheel, so to speak, or how we're all in this together, and if one of us falls, we all fall, sort of thing.
Yeah, I think New York's had a series of defining moments where the city rallies around itself, and it's like a muscle memory in some ways.
Yeah.
Whereas maybe some other places around the world have not had that testing as much, or as a regular basis, it feels like. Yeah. But I mean, LA has had a lot of stuff too, but I don't know. Yeah, it's that denseness, that thing of like you don't have that personal space,
Yeah.
It's totally, you're confronted with everything and everyone right there. So you have to just embrace it almost, because you can't fight it. Whereas other places around the world, you are, in essence, if you're not riding public transportation, you're in a car, and so you're in a bubble and you have this space, and so it's easy to forget that you're part of something much bigger, ecosystem wise.
For sure.
Yeah. Now, the thing I really enjoyed was like when you did bring up in your article about the nostalgia and how the online is just really, everyone's just gone into the archives and everything, so it's interesting. So what I did was I have all my VHSs and I got a converter, and I've now been downloading and just uploading all these digital copies that I had. I mean, digital versions of the VHSs, and I'm like, just keeping them for myself and my friends. So if you need access to any old films for anything, let me know.
No, it's really cool. And I think, I mean, there is something really nice about that. And I think in many ways, it just sort of, for me, it sort of reminds me of how much that watching of video clips, or in my day, it was sort of VHSs. And even my earliest days, it was actually going to the theater when the surf movie rolled through town. But how that's like this sort of, what do you call it? Like a surrogate or a proxy. It's like we can get, that's like the next best thing to getting the actual fix itself. And how avidly we can sort of just consume that stuff.
It's just, I find it interesting though. Like you were talking about before about how, after the recession in the 90s, surfing went back to its core, and, it's happened a lot where the economy, falls, and, the surf industry's had to reinvent itself a few times over. I'm curious, like your connections to the surf industry, how are they coping? How's the industry coping as a whole? And is there optimism, or is there are you seeing that resurgence of refinding its core?
Here's the thing. I'm a little bit, it's strange because when this whole thing was shaking out, I had the same kind of career mortality brush that I had with 9/11, and then again with the global financial crisis, where I sort of went, I feel lucky to be able to write and make and earn a living, and I feel like I get to sort of play in the sandbox, as the expression goes. And as soon as the shit hits the fan, as I've experienced it twice as in the time that I've been a writer, I've thought my thing's going to end, and I'm going to have to kind of get a proper job. And I had that experience with this. So it was sort of the third time over, because I had it after 9/11, I had it after global financial crisis, and then I was having it probably a month ago. And then I suddenly realized I just fall just inside. I do a lot of journalism, and the need to kind of consume, and then the need for sort of reporters or for people to write is big. So I guess in my sphere, which is talking to editors for the most part, everyone seems solid. Of course, there's places that have overhead, and to keep the lights on, they need to be obviously the advertising can fund that. But in terms of the sort of industry itself, I don't know that